Good, I'm looking. 4 o'clock afternoon, we'll take afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to First Parish Church. Thank you to Bill for organizing this and having it here. We're glad we went from, oh, we can fit it in a conference room to, no, let's use the sanctuary. So that's very impressive, but thank you all for coming. Just a few housekeeping items. The first one is there's 4 bathrooms down this hallway if you need that. So there's one right close here and 3 others if you just keep walking. And we are recording this. We're using Zoom now, but it'll be posted to our YouTube channel. If you have a problem with that, move off to the side, and then you won't. Right now, it's mostly the backs of your heads that we're getting. So, and then during the Q&A, if you can wait for Tom to come with the microphone to you, because we won't hear you. You won't get picked up on the Zoom unless you are at a microphone. So we'll bring that to you, okay? Bill, will you introduce our speakers?
Hi, everybody. It's so good to see you here and see you. You're in for a real treat. Michael Verde is a world-renowned speaker. He has just returned fairly recently from a long trip to Australia and New Zealand, where he's very well known, much better known there than he is here in his own country. Michael was born and raised in East Texas, and now lives in Indianapolis, where he is a PhD, finishing his PhD at Indiana University. He founded Memory Bridge in 2003, and it has grown exponentially since then. But we're trying to get that. I got involved with Michael 4 years ago, maybe. Just came across Memory Bridge on the internet and was intrigued and started watching his webinars. And as he said the other day, I'm his biggest groupie right now. I prefer to think of myself as a fanboy, but you know. Michael has so much to offer in the field of how best to form a meaningful relationship and something that is really, if you follow his advice, life-changing for both you and the person with cognitive impairments you may be working with or caring for. It's just a revolution in Alzheimer's care. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Michael, and you are in for a very inspiring and challenging experience.
Well, thank you, Bill. I think you're supposed to under-promise and over-deliver, but I appreciate that, Bill. It's my first time in Gorham, Maine, and Bill, with just a little bit of time to work with, is doing his best to be a tour guide and host. So we were at LL Bean today. And Bill wanted to know if I was interested in that, and when we left there, Bill had made 3 purchases and I hadn't made any, and then he said, are you interested in Orvis? I said, well, sure, Bill. And then we left there and Bill had made a purchase at Orvis. He was starting to figure it out that Bill needed a trip to LL Bean in Orvis, but I was glad to accompany him. We spent the last 3 days in Bar Harbor at the, I think, 32nd annual Maine Geriatrics Conference, where everyone was tremendously kind. And when people ask me about the places that I travel, because I'm so often really only in interior spaces, when I'm not driving or in an airplane, when people ask about places that I've visited, the only real kind of feedback that I can give with any credibility is my experience with the people in those places, because I don't have a lot of time to see things that are in the geography, terrain, or the flora and the fauna, the tourist attractions that people associate with places. So really how I know the places where I travel are the people that I get to meet in that context. And from my time here in Maine, it's a place that I can speak highly about when people ask me about my experience in Maine. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. The talk I'd like to have with you today concerns dementia and the kingdom of God. I don't always get to speak in a church, and when I do, it enables me to open up a little bit of the some of the context of Memory Bridge's own Genesis. I can speak a little bit more freely, in other words, about some of the metaphors and the concepts and the inspiration of what it is that I'm doing here. And so I want to try to combine the idea of dementia with the kingdom of God in a way that I hope is meaningful to you. That said, I'd like to start with monkeys. I want to start with monkeys because I learned that the more you know about monkeys, the more you know about people. And I don't mean that as an insult to people or to monkeys. It's just a fact that we are, we're participants in at least one common matrix called nature. And certain species have a greater degree of overlap in that domain of nature than others. And it so happens that because we're both mammals and primates, that our overlap with monkeys is probably a little bit more significant than we're inclined to acknowledge. In any case, at the University of Texas, before I graduated, my final semester, I took a class on primate behavior. I was very much and am very much interested in evolution. And in the context of this class, we would meet twice a week in the classroom, and then twice a week we were required to go to the monkey laboratory. And in the monkey laboratory, there were 20 monkeys, and it was a vast space, maybe 3/4 the size of the sanctuary, all glass, and there were 20 monkeys. If you're into monkeys, these were Verde and Sykes monkeys. Our responsibility was to first be able to identify all the monkeys by sight and know them by name, but to be able to recognize them reliably. Our second responsibility was to learn 40 behaviors that are typical to monkeys. So we had to memorize the monkeys by name and sight, and then we had to memorize 40 behaviors that monkeys are apt to engage in at any one particular moment. And when we went to the monkey laboratory, once we had memorized those things, we would take a graph sheet of paper, and we could pick any of the 20 monkeys that we wanted, and whichever monkey that we picked for the next 40 minutes, we would observe this monkey, and in every 2-minute interval, we would code what that monkey was doing for the preponderance of those 2 minutes. So if you picked a monkey that was sleeping, and that would have been a good choice if you weren't in the mood, then for the first 2 minutes, you would put an S for sleeping. And this is how it worked for 40 minutes. This is science. This is how we learn. Well, it turns out that these 20 monkeys, most of what they're doing when they're not sleeping is grooming. And monkeys groom not because they're particularly fastidious or vain, but because grooming is a context in which they signal dominance and subordinates. They use grooming as a ritual to indicate to one another where they stand in a status hierarchy. And every monkey in that group of 20 monkeys knew where every other monkey stood in a common vertical axis of really dominance and subordinates. And in the context of grooming, what their respective positions were what was being signaled and reinforced. Now, the way monkeys indicate dominance when they are grooming is the monkey that decides which monkey will groom first is the dominant monkey. It doesn't matter who grooms first or second. It matters which of the two monkeys determines who grooms first and second. And this is really a large part of what monkeys are doing in their waking lives. Now, depending on what position that a monkey holds in this hierarchy, their life can be significantly different. At the top of this monkey hierarchy was a monkey by the name of OP, and OP spent much of his waking life reposed on one elbow, keeping a lazy eye out on what was happening in the monkey community there. And as long as everything was copacetic to OP, he would just watch the show. If, however, any monkey was doing something that OP found off-putting, he would do this, and that is a head bob. If you have not observed and recorded monkey's behavior recently, that's the head bob. And if you were watching OP and he did that, you would put HB for head bob. And that was an indication to the monkey that was doing whatever it was doing to cease and desist. If the monkey did not get the message, that's a double head bob, which means I'm not joking, cut it out. And if that didn't do the trick, then OP would have to go to all the effort to sit up. And then this is a frontal head bob. You have to use the upper torso to make this motion. And that really was the last signal from OP that you were be well advised to refrain from whatever it is that he was signaling was not acceptable in this community. And then if the monkey didn't stop then, OP would go to the source of the malefaction and would administer the necessary degree of physical violence to reinforce the idea that the status hierarchy in this community was not negotiable. Now, at the bottom of the status hierarchy was a monkey by the name of Desdemona, and she spent, well, her days and time awake was spent very differently than OP's. She was missing a lot of hair and suffered from bites and lacerations all over her body, most of which were self-inflicted. And the interesting thing about monkey hierarchies is that they're made from the bottom up, which is a really interesting idea. Now, these are notes that I took during this primate behavior class, that monkey hierarchies are made from the bottom up. So essentially that means that one monkey will assign itself the lowest position, and then another monkey will say, well, then I'm next to the lowest and all the way up, and the person that hasn't committed himself ends up being the dominant monkey, just by virtue of having not chosen any other spot. In any case, Desdemona's life was very different than OP's, as you can imagine, because every time she had an interaction, she needed to demonstrate the requisite degree of obsequiousness or suffer the consequences. And every monkey from the apex to the nadir had a keen understanding of what that monkey's identity was in this community of monkeys. And the monkey's identity, and this is the important point, was predicated on where that monkey was in this in other words, who I am is where I am in this status hierarchy. That is the source of my identity if I lived in this monkey community. Now, about 6 weeks into this class, once I understood what was going on when I was watching, you see, when you first go, you see monkeys that you seem like, well, these monkeys are really into hairstyles and being clean. You just think these are the sweetest monkeys. They just go around and kind of clean each other up for observation, I suppose. But once you understand what's going on, it's a little less Hallmark card kind of a show. But it occurred to me about 6 weeks into this, once that I got it, all of a sudden my junior high days in high school came into perfect clarity. I mean, we didn't groom each other, but you can imagine, and maybe this is true for your high school, there was a whole lot of status indicators and indications happening most all the time. And of course, people had different kinds of reputations or things said about them depending upon, in many instances, where they stood or not in a status hierarchy. You know that certain cliques go by different kind of, these are the jocks, these are the nerds, these are the music people, etc. And in high school and junior high, those kinds of identifiers were a big deal. It's a big deal. A person's experience of that period of his or her life is often reflective of where he or she stands in a status hierarchy. Does any of this resonate with your? Oh, good. Okay, I thought maybe that I just was so old that it was just in the new world they didn't do that anymore. So that's good. That's good news. And for better or worse, it turns out that ended up also being true after high school. Of course, it got a little bit more sophisticated as I got older and found myself into contexts that were a little less crude with respect to signaling and the consequences. But to be candid with you, there's only been a few times in my life where I have ever been in a group of people in which there wasn't some kind of formal or informal kind of status hierarchy in which one's identity was, if not entirely determined, at least significantly influenced. And why am I sharing this with you? I said that we would talk about dementia in the kingdom of God, but the best way that I know for myself to understand the kingdom of God is to first have a very clear understanding of the kingdom of man. I mean, we could call it different things, but we would recognize, for those of you who are into the gospel, that the big, if not the real sole purpose of Jesus' time on earth was to make the kingdom visible. This was really what Jesus went around doing, was having interactions often with people who in the kingdom would have been assigned the lowest, if not relegated to outside of the status hierarchy altogether. I mean, what would it mean to be impure if there wasn't a hierarchy in which such categorizations as pure or impure were meaningful? This is how I understand the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God, seems to be a place where this kind of dominant subordinate hierarchy that seems to be the way that monkeys know what and who they are is not in operation. I'll try to say this again. Where this is not how we know who we are. In other words, I know who I am other than because I am above or beneath somebody. This is how I begin. I'm sharing my own personal experience. This is how I know I'm closer to the kingdom, because I'm no longer doing this. One way that I understand that is in the kingdom of man. I'm using this term. The Apostle Paul called it our life in Adam and contrasted that with our life in Christ. In our life in Adam, according to Apostle Paul, the way I understand that is that our identity is based on a certain kind of knowing the other person, principally by identifying the other as something. In other words, in the kingdom of man, that's like this monkey hierarchy, every person is assigned a category. That who he or she is depends on the category that they're assigned. They identify that some person as something. And this works for everything, not just people. I mean, we could look out the window and see a shimmering green and brown, and we could identify that as a tree, for instance. And we could keep doing that and say, well, that's a pine tree. And then we would identify that tree as something. And you could keep going. That's a fledgling pine tree. But we're still identifying it as something. And we do this with people. So you could imagine that human being is identified as a woman, or as a man, as someone from the South, as a teenager, and you can go on. And this is often how people know other people's identity, is according to what they can identify them as. And this seems to be the way that we have identities in a context that is much like, in my experience, the dominant and subordinate hierarchy of monkeys. So if that's how people know each other in this world of nature, let's call it, where after all evolution reproduces these dominant subordinate hierarchies, this is where this comes from, right? Reproduction, the survival of the fittest. This is how that stuff sort of works. And well, part of our being is part of this universe too. So what was the kingdom of God like if it's not identifying as, and this is my experience, so this is not preaching at you, you can feel whether or not it works for you. But as I understand the kingdom, instead of identifying people as something, it is identifying with somebody. In other words, the people that I love, I don't simply put them in a category, I identify with them. And that's because a part of me is in them and a part of them is in me. Is everybody following with me? I can identify, for instance, I'm thinking of myself here now, once upon a time when my mother's face was the primary source of me having a sense of who I was. I can imagine that in this moment when my mother's looking at me and I'm looking at my mother, that we're not categorizing each other. That's not how we know each other. In these moments, I think we know each other because we're identifying with each other. Who I am and who my mother is and who my mother is and who I am are interpenetrating. In other words, we're not separate enough to categorize because something's happening between us. And this is not only true in the developmental stages of a human being. Apparently, it's part of at least the vision of the gospel, 1 Corinthians 13:12. Now we see as if through a glass darkly, but then we will see face to face, and we will know as we are known. This is an incredible metaphor and symbol of what eternity must be like when we are seeing face to face. And what does it say? That we will know as we are known. I take that to mean that we will be identified with by God, as opposed to identified as. Is everybody following the plot here? This is all going to relate to dementia, I assure you. But the better that we understand this, the more we can understand what it is that is the source of the dis-ease of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's disease, that's an objective condition. That's when an organism's function or structure is being impaired by some kind of change at the molecular or cellular level. That's an objective reality. But the dis-ease of Alzheimer's, or the dis-ease of one of the other neurodegenerative diseases associated with Alzheimer's, the dis-ease is not an objective thing that can be diagnosed. The dis-ease is an experience. Author Kleinman makes a distinction in medical anthropology between a disease and an illness. A disease is something you can assign a measurement, but an illness is a person's subjective experience of whatever that physiological substrate is. Is everybody following with me with the distinction? Okay, so when I talk about the dis-ease of Alzheimer's or the dis-ease of one of these other forms of dementia, I'm talking about a person's experience of whatever is happening neurologically. And I'm suggesting that if we want to understand the dis-ease of Alzheimer's and the dis-ease of frontotemporal dementia or Lewy body dementia or vascular dementia or mixed dementia, if we want to understand the dis-ease of it, the more we understand a person feeling identified with versus identified as. Because often what happens when a person's diagnosed with dementia, people begin to cease to identify with them and begin to identify them as. Now already you're a person with dementia. We've identified you as. And there are big consequences that follow when people know us by identifying us as something versus knowing us by identifying with. To give you an example of how this monkey stuff works in the world of dementia, I was speaking in South Florida, speaking on literature. In my other life, I talk about works of literature, and it just so happened that someone in that group of people, these were all affluent people in a gated community, and it's not Palm City, maybe Palm City, right next to Stewart, Florida. I think it's Palm City. In any case, I see a nod in the background, Palm City. This was a gated community in Palm City, a place you would want to live. It was a most desirable gated community, really, in that area, and I had been invited to speak on To Kill a Mockingbird. And after the talk, one of the participants heard that I did something with this organization called Memory Bridge that had something to do with dementia. And she came over to me and she wanted to whisper so that other people didn't hear. She said, you know, my husband and I had lots of friends in this community. And then he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and all our friends disappeared. Now that's, in this community, apparently, who you are is where you are on some kind of dominant subordinate status hierarchy. And if you get identified as a person with Alzheimer's, your standing However close you may not been to OP, you're very, very close to Desdemona, or you're off the hierarchy altogether. Is everybody following the plot now? This is why we started with monkeys. And obviously, how people interact with us in that world, consciously or unconsciously, is a reflection of how they are identifying us as. And what this lady was trying to tell me is, we used to be somebody here. And then we got identified as, or my husband got identified as, and then all of a sudden we weren't anybody that any other body wanted to be identified with. And as I understand the kingdom of God, it would be the opposite of this. This is just how I understand the gospel, that Jesus went around to people who had been identified as sinners, who had been identified as lepers, who had been identified as tax collectors, or any number of other things that made them untouchable in a more or less literal sense, and that Jesus, what he did with such people is to eat with them, because there are few things that we can do that are more intimate than sharing food with another person. Now, the leper, it says that Jesus touched the leper to heal the leper. We know that Jesus didn't have to touch people to heal them. The centurion's son, Jesus told the centurion to go home and that his son would be healed. So he didn't need to touch his son. But the leper, Jesus touched the leper. And I don't know the reason for that. I'm not an expert in these kinds of ways, but it imaginatively would seem to me that if Jesus touched the leper, then the leper could know it doesn't matter what these people say you are, including untouchable. God says you are touchable. And the proof is that God just touched you. So that's proof that you're touchable. And I could imagine if someone felt that they were untouchable and then all of a sudden they knew they were touchable because God touched them. I could imagine that that person would have been healed even if their leprosy didn't disappear. In other words, the healing was not the same thing as a curing. And what I know about people with Alzheimer's disease in this country, and in my experience, every Western country, is that our civilization is very invested in curing those people, but not so invested in touching or being touched by those people. Well, that's not to say anything except that's sort of how it works over here. But the good news is, and I think in this instance it really is the good news, the good news is that doesn't have to be how it works everywhere. And wherever we are, where the kingdom is, that's not how it works at all. So that's good news indeed. Let me see if I can put an image to what I'm talking about. This is just a little diagram, 1 through 7. These are, let's say, these are depths of meaningfulness in any interaction between two people. So you can say we have, let's say, 26 conversations a day. Apparently, that's probably an urban legend that we have on average 26 conversations a day, so don't quote that as empirically verified. But in any case, however many conversations we have a day, we know that some are more meaningful than others. And this is how I make sense of that, one being the most superficial, or transactional, and 7 being the most intimate and meaningful. This is how I imagine it. So, for instance, when I go to Kroger to get Nutella, do you guys have Nutella? Well, fantastic. When I go to Kroger to get Nutella and I'm interacting with the cashier, I'm from East Texas, so I'm probably shooting the breeze with her, and it could be very pleasant. But the truth of the matter is that I am interacting because I need the Nutella. You know, in other words, my relationship is a means to an end. The end is the Nutella. And I'm guessing as far as the cashier is concerned that I'm a means to an end. The end may be to feed one's family. And so this is a means to feeding one family, is exchanging Nutella for cash. So there doesn't need to be anything necessarily negative about a one-level conversation. It's just largely meaningless. I mean, once I get the Nutella and I get to the car, I'm probably not thinking about the cashier at all, and probably was much sooner than even by the time I got to the car. Now, if we think about seven would be the opposite of that. This would be an interaction for which there is no extrinsic purpose whatsoever. There is no end other than the means. In other words, I'm being with you because it is intrinsically fulfilling, not because there's something I want to get out of it, and not because there's something you want to get out of me. We're experiencing this kind of communion, this kind of intimacy, this kind of affection because it fulfills us. This is what makes me who I am, is being with you in this way. And that's, of course, the very opposite of a means to an end. This is where the end and the means are inextinguishable. In fact, this is, you could say, perfect identifying with. And this is perfect identifying as. And everything in between is a greater or lesser degree of one of those, or both. 4 is not exactly on the spectrum. 4 is what I call the valley of awkward. The valley of awkward. But you know, that term must resonate with people, because even before I share what it means, people seem to have a sense of the valley of awkward. You know, young people, awkward is one of the big words today. If you see these young people on Instagram or whatever, that was awkward. You know, awkward will just be in any situation where you're not confident that you and the other person are in mutual understanding about what we're doing here. Awkward's any time you begin to feel self-conscious. Awkward is where you feel like eyes may be looking at you and you may somehow not pass in some kind of way. That's awkward. And the reason I put that here is that in my experience, often to get to these deeper interactions, often, if not always, involves passing through this valley of awkward. And this is where we're risking something here to get to know each other better. And often, because this is a risk, we choose to stay here. Because you could be hurt here. I'm making myself vulnerable. You may not identify with me. So if I risk this, I could be hurt. But if I don't ever risk this, I'm probably pretty safe. I would say this is how we live. This is the interactions that get us through, that achieve something. This is how we live, and I'm going to propose this is why we live. And again, I'm suggesting to myself that to get to the why from the how often involves the risk of identifying with each other. Now, if you got this, you will understand at least how I understand the dementia journey. Because in my experience, this is another way of sharing with you what I have previously. In my experience, when someone is diagnosed with dementia, they begin to receive fewer and fewer 5 through 7 interactions and more 3 to 1 interactions. They may receive the same amount of attention. They may receive more attention, but it tends to be the kind of attention that has an objective to it. And this need not be a negative thing. The people that are attending to us in this way are often doing that to try to help us. So this is not necessarily that someone is treating us badly. It's simply that they are treating us, to a certain or lesser extent, as if who we are could be identified as a person with dementia. So what I want to say is that when a person ceases to get a certain amount of 5 through 7 attention, they start to experience the dis-ease of Alzheimer's. That when enough of this kind of attention disappears, a person begins to experience a kind of pain. It's a profound kind of pain. In fact, I would go so far to say is that we need this kind of attention to feel like we're human. And if we don't get enough of this attention, we start to feel like maybe we're not human. And that's a very painful kind of feeling. Is everybody following with me? You know, once we understand this, there's actually good news here, by the way. The good news is there is something that we can do about this situation that doesn't involve finding a cure. Because there's nothing inevitable about a person receiving less and less 5 through 7 attention because they're diagnosed with a form of irreversible dementia. The fact that a person often does is a choice that the people around this person make. It's nothing neurological. There's nothing about cognitive impairment, in other words, that impairs a person's ability to participate in 5 through 7 modes of communication. In other words, you don't have to know the day of the week to participate in 5 through 7 interactions. You don't have to know who the president is. You don't have to be able to count backwards from 100 by 7. You don't even have to know your spouse's name to participate in 5 through. What's my evidence for that? Well, again, I'll go back to my interaction here with my mother once upon a time. Perhaps with other people it was a father, but in any case for me it was my mother. And I'm guessing that my mother and I had the most 5 through 7 intense kinds of interactions that maybe I've ever had in my life, and I couldn't say a single word. And I didn't know the day of the week, and I wasn't even interested, much less who the president was. And if you'd have told me about counting backwards from 100, I said, well, I'll just stay here. I wouldn't even have gone to school at all because that'd be the kind of thing that wouldn't interest me then. The point of the matter is that I'm trying to say is there was nothing that impaired me cognitively to have the most intense emotional resonance interactions in my life with somebody else, and therefore I'm inferring that there's nothing about impairment cognitively that keeps a person from feeling an intense form of recognition and mutual resonance. And that's not just a theory. What I'm sharing with you now is simply an empirical fact. Scientists make sense of a lot of processes as either top-down or bottom-up. And top-down processes are things that involve cognition. These are the kind of abstract intellectual things that we are consciously participating in. But as you know, most of our survival depends upon things that we're not conscious of. Our entire nervous system, for instance, and our autonomic system. Our entire body, in other words, is doing all kinds of things without us consciously participating in it. And this is the bottom-up processes that don't disappear when a person has cognitive impairment. Do you see what I'm saying? You can have the top-down processes be impaired, but your body is still very mindful of its surroundings. There's a word for it, neuroception. Neuroception is the kind of perception that we have even when we're not cognitively involved. And one of the things that we're constantly doing with our neuroception is determining whether we're in a safe situation socially. Why? Because we're mammals and our survival depends upon our relationship with other mammals. So our entire nervous system is getting feedback. Am I safe here? And of course, you can imagine that if the people around you are identifying you as something at the bottom of some kind of value hierarchy, that you may not be feeling all that safe. This is absolutely good news. This is absolutely good news. Why is it good news? Because everybody in this room, by virtue of being human, is qualified to enter into 5 through 7 interactions with people with cognitive impairment. That's good news for people with cognitive impairment. It's good news for you. But notice how much of our society doesn't talk about this when we talk about people with dementia. Let's consider for just a second this notion of the dementia journey. Everybody, have you heard of the dementia journey? It's a kind of ubiquitous, okay. And you've probably heard of things called stages. Have you heard of stages? Okay, there's usually 3 or 5 or 7. Well, for somehow, the dementia journey metaphor and the dementia stages metaphor, they found each other and they wedded so that we typically imagine the dementia journey as something like this. Upon diagnosis, I put one foot on a conveyor belt. And starting in that instant, this conveyor belt begins to move rapidly or slowly, but nevertheless inexorably begins to move. And it begins to move through stages. There's maybe the early stage, mid stage, end stage. And the interesting thing about this dementia journey is no matter what stage I am, every second that I move further down the dementia journey, I'm somehow less of a person than I was the previous second. So this is an interesting kind of journey to be on. And at the end of the journey, I get the huge satisfaction of dying. Once upon a time, I'd have to go through the vegetable stage before I got the... Now, this is a strange way to think of a journey. I'm trying to think of any other journeys in my life if I ever imagined it according to this kind of trajectory. I can't think of one. Not long ago, I was flying back home from Indonesia, and on the seat in front of me, there was a little monitor, and they had a map of the whole planet, a globe, three-dimensional. And on one side, it was where I departed. And then the other side, in this case, it was Bali, and I was going to land in Indianapolis. It said the departure, this is arrival, and then there was an avatar of the plane. And all along, I could see how this plane was getting closer and closer to my destination. And it said at the top, this is your journey. And as I was looking at that, I was thinking, now that's how I typically think of a journey. And then I started comparing it to the dementia journey. And I started thinking, these are two very different ways to imagine a journey. Because in this journey that I'm on this plane, when I land in Indianapolis, I have something to look forward to. When I reach my destination, there's going to be somebody that loves me, that's going to greet me, that's going to welcome me. We're going to share a big hugs and say some things that probably don't matter, but we're just so excited to see each other that we're just enjoying each other's resonance. And I get to look forward to that. And every second I get closer to that experience of communion and reunion, of a kind of ecstasy upon arrival. And then after that greeting, then I get to move into the rest of my life. In other words, I'm landing, and then this is my future. That's a journey that seems like one that I would want to take. But how different is that from the dementia journey? Where when you get to the end, there's not someone to welcome you and greet you, the beginning of the future. It's just the end of the end. Now, I would say if anybody in this room or outside of this room was to plug into their imagination that this trajectory was what the future of their life looked like, they would instantly experience ill-being. If anybody in this room imagined that this is what your future was, you would instantly experience ill-being, because we're not creatures designed to live with that kind of sense of the future. Is everybody following with me? And yet, if you are assigned this label, dementia, then you also get a script. You're on the dementia journey. Now, this has nothing to do with neurons. You see what I'm saying? You can't find stages in the brain. There's no such thing as early stage in the brain. You can't get an MRI or any other mode of measurement that will give you this little schema. That's a social construction. And the only reason that's plausible must be because we somehow imagine that our identity and brain cells are two ways of saying the same thing, right? If we're slowly disappearing, if my identity is slowly disappearing, and it's because of changes in my brain, then my identity must be related to my brain. Is everybody following? The only way that I could believe that I was slowly disappearing, my identity, is if my identity and my brain cells were indistinguishable. But what if that's not the source of our identity? What if the source of our identity is not our brain cells? This is probably a big, important conversation to have in a church. Because I don't recall Jesus ever saying that our identity was in our brain cells. So this may be why it's partly good news. Where is my identity? I want to go back again and again to this face, my mother's face looking at me. Now, this is not the beginning of my biological life. My biological life started about 9 months earlier. But somewhere between 6 and 12 months, I started to have a sense of being a self. And that came after I was born. This sense of self that I had to do with my mother's face and my mother's presence. Is everybody following with me? In other words, I started to know who I was because of this face looking at me. In other words, my identity came in the context of a relationship. My biological life came just through nature, but my sense of being an identity came with my interaction with another person. We can have as a test case these terribly tragic examples of every once in a while they call them feral children that somehow survive biologically but outside of any meaningful human interaction. And we know that those children are biologically alive, but they don't have sense of self. Is everybody following the plot? I'm trying to understand where myself comes from because I want to know if it's true that myself is going to disappear when I get diagnosed with dementia. So that's why I'm interested in this. Here's a way we can think about it. If I ask you to show me yourself right now, I feel like you couldn't do it. I think you could say, well, and I'd say, well, that's your forehead. What about yourself? And I think you could keep pointing and I would say, oh, that's your ear. Show me yourself. And I don't think you could do it. And if I said, listen, you see if you can see yourself in the mirror, I don't think you could do it. I think you could see your eyes. You see what I'm saying? I don't think you would see yourself. And yet I'm pretty confident everybody in here feels like, well, that not only you have a self, but that you are a self. So I feel like I am a self. So how do we know that we are selves if we've never seen it? Now, we live in a time when empirical evidence is a big deal, and I'm suggesting we don't have empirical evidence, if you mean by something you could measure, that we even have selves, and yet we feel like we do. So how do we feel that we have a self? My guess is that we feel that we have a self because we've caught glimpses of our image in other people's faces. I've seen how you are looking at me, and therefore, if you are looking at me that way, I must be. Do you see what I'm saying? That I know who I am because I see images of myself in your eyes. I see me in your eyes, so therefore I know I have a me. In fact, this is where my me came from, is that I got images of myself from the way you talked to me, the way you touched me or didn't talk to me or didn't touch to me. And then because of that, I started to have confidence that I am a self because of what you gave me. Now, this is a very different way to think about identity with brain cells, right? Because if this is the case, if I get my identity from the way that you reflect an image to me, then the only way I can disappear, if this is the source of my identity, the only way I can disappear is if you do that. As long as you're here, it doesn't matter if I'm over here because my identity's not down here. Is everybody following with me? We're getting to how we can heal the dis-ease of Alzheimer's. And I'm suggesting we're going to heal it largely by the way we look at people who've been identified as people with dementia. Because they're going to look in our face and they're not going to see just a person with dementia. They're going to see somebody that is lovable, somebody that belongs, somebody that matters, somebody whose life is no less worthy than my own. That's what they're going to see in my eyes. And then that's how they're going to know that it's true. I'm suggesting that our lives are in each other's faces and that what we most need from each other is a kind of attention that I'm saying is 5 through 7 attention. Now, it's important to say this because when you go on the internet or you get whatever source of information about people with dementia, you're going to learn a lot of things about 3 through 1. You're going to learn how to manage their behaviors. Notice their behaviors. You know, when any two people meet within 1/20th of a second, that's before we're conscious of it, within 1/20th of a second, both people make a judgment of each other. And the fundamental judgment, this is appraisal theory from psychology, the fundamental appraisal that we make of the other person is either an us, which means one of my people, or the other person is a them, which means not my people. And we make this before we're conscious of it. But based on that appraisal, we have our endocrine system responds. If we appraise the other as a them, the amygdala releases a hormone, and our body has feelings between disgust and fear. If we appraise the other as us, the amygdala releases oxytocin, and we have feelings of wanting to get closer, physically and emotionally. And notice this happens before we're conscious of it. And what I'm saying is when people get identified as people with dementia, they very quickly become thems. And I'm suggesting that the discourse on dementia, it's not ill-intended, but it's all designed about how to handle them, to deal with them. Now, there are times when we need our behavior managed. I'm 58. There are times I need my behavior managed. And I'm grateful for people that intervene and manage my behavior in such instances. But I think you would agree that you need more than your behavior managed. And yet in the discourse in the field of dementia, we think of care in two ways. Keeping someone biologically alive, which is, that's nice. But let's don't underestimate that. Number two, managing their behavior. And that's what care means in the discourse. And I'm proposing that as important as both of those things may be, that there's another thing that a human being needs that is not reducible to their behavior being managed. And that this other thing that a person needs in order to feel like a human being is to look into a face that sees this person and identifies with them and not identifies them as something. Is everybody following the plot? I hope this is good news to you, because if this situation was entirely neurological, we would leave here, and I don't think there would have been much we could have known except how tragic the situation is. But this situation that I'm defining, there's a lot everybody can do to heal the disease of Alzheimer's. And it can begin when you leave here, and it's going to be pretty concrete. Let me give you an example of how this works. Let's say I have a neighbor named William, and every day before breakfast, William and I meet at our edges of our driveway. We're going to check our mail or get the paper. And in the context of this daily ritual, we visit with each other. And we've been doing it for 18 years, and we look forward to it. You could say that William and I are good friends. And let's say this is Monday. And then Monday afternoon, I learned from a common neighbor that William has dementia. On Tuesday, when I go to get the mail, it will still be my neighbor William that I meet, except on Tuesday, it will be my neighbor William with dementia. And with that little switch in my imagination, there's about a 99% chance that the way that I communicate with William is going to change. It may not be that I'm looking down at William. To the contrary, this is my friend. I might be particularly kind today, but for the last 18 years, I haven't been particularly kind. I haven't been particularly anything because I've just been with my friend William. That's been one of the reasons I could look forward to it, because once we trusted each other, once we got to here, we didn't need to put on certain images or impress each other or play those kinds of games that I have to play up here. But today is going to be a little bit different, because I am very likely, at least a part of myself, is going to step back from the, not physically, but a part of me emotionally, psychologically, is going to step back from my interaction with William as a participant, and I'm going to begin to observe my interaction with William. A part of me is going to try to figure out what's going on with a person with dementia. Is this early stage? Is this the middle stage? Or am I doing a good job interacting with a person with dementia? Do you see what I'm doing now? I'm partly over here with William, but I'm partly over here observing me over here with William. And to the extent that I do that, guess what? That's the extent to which William doesn't receive the same emotional resonance from me that he has for the last 18 years. Something between us will have decreased. The 5 through 7 will have become thinner and thinner. and the 3-2-1 will have become more and more pervasive. But maybe that's no big deal because I'm just William's neighbor. But what if everybody in William's life, when they hear William has dementia, does this same little thing in their imagination that I did? What about William's grandson? Now it's his grandfather with dementia. And what about William's old buddies from work? Now it's their old buddy William with dementia. And what about William's wife? It's now her husband William with dementia. And if everybody makes this little switch that I did, and everybody steps back from immediately being with William and begins to observe, if each of these people remove their emotional resonance by no longer identifying with William, can you imagine 360 degrees of people removing their 5 through 7 attention from you? What happens to William? Well, William finds himself in an island. And keep in mind, I'm talking about Monday through Tuesday, so we can't blame it on his neurons. With a diagnosis, a blink of a diagnosis, everything in William's life will be exactly the same and completely different. And the difference won't be neurological. And that's the disease of Alzheimer's. And here's the good news. There's nothing inevitable about that. I don't have to convince myself that William doesn't have dementia. That's not the goal. What I can understand is that there's nothing about a diagnosis that turned William into a different species. Yes, William may have dementia. He may have any number of things. I probably have 101 things. We could both have people with stuff all day long, but over and above whatever we have about us, we are more than that. Do you see what I mean? It's not just a person with dementia. Yes, things may change between us cognitively, but that doesn't mean that the relationship needs to get less meaningful. This relationship may get more meaningful. The meaningfulness of a relationship is not correlated with how intellectually sophisticated it is. Is everybody following with me? It could be that now William and I learn what the word neighbor really means. What a wonderful opportunity to learn what it is to be a neighbor. Now, there's things in William's life that may be helpful to know about dementia, but one thing that we should always keep in mind is that William is still going to want people to identify with him. Not 24/7, nobody needs that, but sometime every day, everybody needs to feel somebody identifying with them and not only identifying them as something. And when we identify with somebody in that way, then they get to be human again, and we heal what can't be cured. And this is good news. Okay, let me share with you what that looks like in real time when somebody who's only been receiving this kind of attention for a long time starts to receive this kind of attention. Let's see what it looks like, and then we'll say one other thing and do whatever we want to. We're grown people.
So many feel awkward with
Well, I know a little bit of the backstory to Harris and Darcy's relationship. Harris and the Kanzer family, Harris could have lived anywhere in the United States. They had the sort of means where money wasn't a variable in Mr. Kanzer's, this portion of his life. And the place where he did live and where this was filmed is the most desirable place in this part of Florida. And for good reason. Not only is it just beautiful on the inside and out, not only are all the amenities comparable to a 5-star, but the staff there have been known to not only receive all the requisite education, but they take pride in going beyond what it is that's required by the state to be able to offer in an exemplary way what's called person-centered care. And I'm quite confident that if we'd asked anybody what kind of care Harris was receiving, they would have told you to a person that he was receiving person-centered care. And yet I'm also confident that had Darcy not come into Harris's life, he would have lived and died in this most desirable location, a dirty old man. And not only would he have lived and died a dirty old man, I'm certain that there would not have been any sense that there was another Harris to be cared for besides the dirty old man. In other words, there wouldn't have been a sense that there was anything that he wasn't receiving that was necessary. They would have imagined that he was receiving the optimal kind of care. And yet when Darcy came into his life, who had no training with regards to communicating with people with dementia, she had no tools in her toolbox. That's an interesting metaphor. Do you know in the dementia discourse, people are going around the world getting tools in their toolbox to deal with those people? Now, I don't know about you, but tools are something that in my experience you use on objects to manipulate. I'm not trying to point fingers, but I am trying to say these metaphors give us away. We think when you're diagnosed with that, you are somehow not a person the way we're people. And not only do we think that, we're not shamed about it because we'll just tell you, you want to get better dealing with those people, you need tools in your toolbox. Again, there may be instances where people need their behavior managed. But if that's all that we mean by care, then we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what a human being is and what a human being needs. And I'm talking about primary needs. In any case, because Darcy came into Mr. Kanzer's life with no training, we discovered that there was something more than a dirty old man in Mr. Kanzer. When Harris started to receive 5 through 7 attention, and I think everyone would agree that Mr. Kanzer was perfectly capable of participating in 5 through 7. So there wasn't any lack of capacity that explained why Mr. Kanzer wasn't receiving this kind of attention. But anyway, the point is, a person receives this kind of attention, they're one kind of person. A person receives this kind of attention, they're another kind of person. So when people tell me about how somebody is with dementia, I usually keep my mouth shut. But what I'm thinking to myself is, with whom are they that kind of person? Because you can have one person diagnosed with dementia in this room and 2 different caregivers can go in the room and they'll find 2 different people, which is amazing because that's the same brain, the same biology, the same physiology, but they found 2 different people. How did that happen? It must be that part of our humanity is not just in our biology. Part of our humanity must be in the person who comes in the room. That goes back to here. Here's an example that keeps me in tune. If you take a tuning fork, and it's the right frequency as another tuning fork, and you bring that tuning fork in proximity to the other tuning fork, something called sympathetic resonance, this other tuning fork will start to vibrate. So what often happens is someone is diagnosed with dementia and you imagine they're a tuning fork, and then we're going to offer person-centered care. We walk in the room and we're taught, focus on the person, not the disease. See the person behind the disease. Focus on the person, not the task. So we walk in the room, there's a tuning fork, and we're trying to focus on the person. That's one way to walk in the room. Another way to walk in the room is to be a tuning fork. Tap it and walk in the room and get by the other tuning fork. Is everybody with me? You see, people come alive when we offer them a certain kind of vibration, but we have to offer it to them. You see, if we walk in the room and we're not resonating, you're not going to resonate either. Is everybody with me? This means it's not a biological thing, it's a resonant thing. And you don't have to have lots of cognitive capacity to resonate, because that happens with the nervous system, and every cell in our body will resonate, but we got to walk in and resonate. And the way you resonate is to identify with somebody, and then they'll start to resonate. One last example, and then I'll share a story. We can call it a day. Imagine there's a plant in the closet, and the plant is languishing. And imagine that what we're doing is calling in languishing plant experts to teach us how to manage the behavior of languishing plants. We can go and get tools in our toolbox when plants are languishing. And that's one way to respond to languishing plants. Apparently, it's an economically viable way because we've been doing it for years. Another way to respond to a plant languishing in the closet would be to walk in the closet, take the plant, walk to a windowsill where there's sunshine and add water. That's another way to respond to a languishing plant. So real quickly, so that nobody is saying that I gave a lot of nice things but not practical, concrete advice. Here's some practical, concrete advice. Somebody who's been identified as day in and day out is going to be like a plant languishing in the closet. And if you will identify with that person, in other words, you look in them and you see that they're not just a person with dementia, but there is somebody that is lovable, that there's somebody that is more like you than not like you. Because when we have dementia, we both need the same primary things. We both need food and water. We both need affection. We both need other people to look at us like we're real people. We both need about the same absolute things. Now, there's a few things that maybe somebody's better at Sudoku than another. But what we need, and I'm not making light of cognitive impairment, but what I am trying to make a distinction is that things from the neck up don't exhaust who we are, and they don't exhaust our needs. This is an important point. So if we want to add sunshine and water in this metaphor, then we look at somebody like they're a person and not just a member of a category. And the more we get to know them and all their uniqueness, the more we will know that the dementia doesn't define them. The less we know them, the more the dementia will define them. Is everybody following with me? The less somebody knows about a person from a distance, then they're just somebody from the South who's African-American, LGBTQ. That's just what they are, because that's all we know. But when you get closer to someone who has all those labels, you'll learn that they're more than just those things. And that's true for all of us. So the more we get to know someone with dementia, the more we'll know that they're not just a person with dementia. And when we start to know them that way, we will resonate and they will resonate. And that will heal what can't be cured. And this is not a tool in a toolbox. Okay, I want to share with you how I got into this, and then we can do whatever you want to do. In 1988, I was about a year away from graduating at the University of Texas, and I started to have a panic attack because I had fantasized that when you went off to school, at college, you would graduate and that you would somehow be transformed. And then you would go back, I'm from a little town in East Texas, you would go back transformed, and people in your little town from time to time would come up and ask you questions about life, and you would, very tactfully, because of your degree of modesty now, you would drop little tidbits of wisdom, and that they would, they would put them in their pocket, and you wouldn't point out that you had said anything special, but years later, that would go off, and they would think, how did he know that? Well, anyway, that wasn't happening to me when I went to college. I wasn't becoming any wiser. Honestly, I think I was devolving. And so I didn't want to graduate in this, deplorable situation. So I quit school and I moved to Paris, France, for the sole purpose of finding myself. I wanted to find myself before I graduated. Now, in California, they started looking for themselves in the 60s. I'm from East Texas. It took 30 years before we realized we were lost, much less that we could be found. But anyway, I went to Paris. I don't know why I thought I might be there, and I went looking for myself. I would go into museums. I remember the first time a friend took me to Musée Picasso, and I embarrassed myself by saying, who couldn't do that? There's three noses. Just things like that. I would go to art exhibits. I was reading a lot. I'd go to coffee shops. I took a class in college on philosophy. I learned about existentialism and someone named Sartre, and there was something about angst. And I knew Sartre lived in Paris. And so I would go in coffee shops and order espresso with an S, and I would try to be angst because I thought that might help me find myself. But it didn't. In any case, after all of these harebrained projects, I did run across in my reading something called koans, K-O-A-N, part of Zen Buddhism. A koan is a saying that doesn't make rational sense, that when the student goes to the master seeking enlightenment, in this tradition of Zen, they're given a koan. The most well-known koan in the West is is the sound of one hand clapping. Perhaps you've heard of that. It's an epigraph to one of J.D. Salinger's books. What is the sound? And these koans are designed not to make sense. The point is that when you get a koan and you reflect on it, that part of your brain that's analytical, that has to figure things out, well, it can't figure out a koan. So at a certain point, it'll give up. And that's good, because when that part of your psyche gives up, then other parts of our psyche can get a word in edgewise. And in the Eastern tradition, it's that other part of our psyche where enlightenment comes from. So since I hadn't found myself in any other way, I said, well, I need a koan. So I got a collection of koans, and I said, okay, I'm just going to randomly turn the page and put my finger down without looking, and whatever koan I get, that's my koan. And I did, and where my finger landed was, show me the face you wore before your mother and father were born. I said, well, that doesn't make sense. I started to put it back, but you can't put your coin back. It doesn't work that way. Now, I was stuck with that. So once a day, for 45 minutes to an hour, I go to my little studio at Moat Piquet Grenelle, 15th arrondissement, if you know Paris, and I would meditate on my coin. Now, I did not know how to meditate. I mentioned I grew up Southern Baptist. We did not meditate a lot. But I did know two things. I knew two things. Number one, you should be quiet when you meditate. And number two, your legs should be uncomfortable. I knew that, and I thought, well, I can work with this. And so every day for 45 or 60 minutes, I would sit uncomfortably from the waist down, and I would meditate on my coin, show me the face you wore before your mother and father were born. And it didn't mean anything to me for 11 months and 10 days. But on the 10th day of the 11th month, this coin stuff worked. It worked for me. I had complete and total clarity. It's not like I heard a voice. It wasn't a Shirley MacLaine situation, but I did have clarity. And the clarity that I suddenly had, the face you wore before your mother and father were born, were the faces of your grandparents. That made perfect sense to me. And therefore, I needed to get on a plane and get back to East Texas, because if I was going to find myself, it would be back with my grandparents in East Texas and not in Paris, France. 10 days later, I landed at George Bush Houston Intercontinental Airport. My stepdad and mom picked me up on the way back home. I asked if we could pull into Walmart. I bought all the 90-minute cassettes that Walmart had. I borrowed my little brother's jam box, and then I moved in with both sets of my grandparents in different parts of East Texas. And just for the purpose of living with them, and any time there was an opportunity, when we weren't doing something else, if they were in the mood for it, I would get my little brother's jam box, I would get those cassettes, and I would just ask them to tell me about their lives. And I was keenly interested for the first time in my life. I was looking for the face that I wore before my mother and father were born in these stories. Well, I had one grandpa that really, really enjoyed this process. He would sit in his orange recliner. I was in the couch caddy corner. There was my little brother's jam box with a tape cassette whirring, and then there was a Folgers coffee can, a big one with paper towel stuff. That was his spit tune. He loved chewing tobacco. And then every time we had finished one side of the cassette, I'd raise my hand. That meant to stop. I'd switch the cassette, and while I was doing that, I would hear, and that was him preparing for the next 45 minutes. And we did this for hours. And I'm glad that I did. I'm glad that I did. Because 5 years after I got about 16 to 20 hours of these stories, my grandfather began to evince conspicuous symptoms of memory loss. First, it started with common names. I remember when he couldn't remember the word hockey. Now, you can live in East Texas a very generative life and never one time say the word hockey. So this wasn't a big deal. But then there came a time when he wasn't able to reliably recall the names of good friends. I remember when he was going to tell me the story again about Charlie Waldrop, Mr. Waldrop, during the Depression, my grandfather was unemployed. And of course, means of survival were few and far between. But Mr. Waldrop went to the higher ups, he called them, at Sun Oil Company. And he said to them, I know a man, Charlie Leonard, and he's a good man. And we could use him on our crews. And because of Mr. Waldrop's intervention with the higher ups, my granddaddy was able to feed his family. And he was going to tell me again how grateful he was to Mr. Waldrop for doing this, but on this occasion, he couldn't remember Charlie Waldrop's name. Now, from the outside in, that would be, memory loss, but from the inside out, that was the dis-ease. See, from the inside out, my grandfather felt that he was betraying a friend. Here has been somebody that had been so good and went above and beyond and make it possible for him to feed his family in a time of need, and he didn't have the decency to remember that man's name. I could see it on his face. That was a dis-ease. You wouldn't have found that with a CAT scan. And then there came a time that if my grandfather left the house, he might not reliably make it back. And my grandmother wasn't in the best of health, so the family wasn't sure what to do. So we got together. We didn't have an organization like Home Instead or another organization in your community that could help us in these kinds of situations. And what we came up with is that we would just reverse the locks on all the doors and everybody'd have a key but my grandfather. Now, if you ever visited my grandfather and at a certain point you told him, now, Charlie, I'm going to need to go home, he would say, oh, boy, oh, girl, what's your hurry? You could have been there 40 minutes or 40 weeks. It wouldn't have mattered. He would have still tried to beseech upon you that there was no hurry. But if you convinced him you needed to leave, what he was going to do is help you gather up your things. He was going to escort you to your car. He was going to put them in the trunk or the back seat as was your preference. And when you were ensconced behind the wheel, he was going to do like this. And when you rolled down the window, he was going to say, now, boy, you'll be home in 52 minutes. He was a track coach, so this was his language of love to time. But what he was saying was, I'm so grateful you came. I want you to know I'll be thinking about you even when you're driving home. That's just what he did. But on this particular occasion, when I'm leaving, I recall that my grandfather's not going out the back door. So very tactfully, I take from him my things, and at the last possible moment, I beat a hasty path in front of him. I go out the back door, and I shut it and lock it. My grandfather comes to the door. It was a glass door, and it was the rectangles, like latticed rectangles, partitioned all the way up and down the door. My grandfather and I are the same height, so we're eye to eye, about this far apart, except there's a glass pane between us. And I could hear the doorknob turning, but without purchase. And I could see coming across my grandfather's face the dawning awareness that he wasn't going out that door because of a decision that I was making. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you felt that your grandparent felt that you were punishing him or her. But if you have, you will know it is a terrible dis-ease. I could see on his face, boy, why can't I come with you? You see, to go to the car and to do this is what it meant to be Charlie Leonard. This ritual. And it dawned on me, a grandfather is not a noun, a grandfather is a verb. A doing verb and a being verb. Probably in that moment I decided that this was unacceptable, this glass pane, that if there wasn't a way that my grandfather could come with me, there must be a way that I could go with him. Probably that's when Memory Bridge was born. In any case, there came a day when my grandfather couldn't feed himself. There came a day when he wasn't able to shower himself. And there came a day when my grandfather wasn't able to toilet himself. And then there came a day when my grandfather was no longer with us as far as I could see. And my family, we lived all across Texas, but we came to my grandparents' house for his funeral. We remembered ourselves, R-E-membered. You see, we were dismembered as a family across the state. But on this occasion, his funeral, we remembered our dismembered body. And at some point on the first night, my mother said, why don't you go get those tapes you made years ago and play one of those stories? I think it would bring solace to the family. I thought that was a good idea. I knew where my grandmother kept the tapes. I found a cassette player. I put it in the middle of the living room. I got what I knew to be my grandfather's favorite story. I put it in the cassette player, turned up the volume, and hit play. And then my grandfather's voice began to emanate up out of the center of the living room. Now, I didn't know what was going to happen, obviously, but what did happen is that instantly the din in the house, the conversation subsided, and people began to make their way into the living room as if by instinct, in pairs or singly or even more. But from wherever they were, I noticed that my family had soon found their way into the living room, and they had circled around my grandfather's voice coming up out of the center of the living room. And I thought to myself, my grandfather has pulled a trick on Alzheimer's disease. Because when Alzheimer's disease came to take away his self, it was too late. He had already given his self away. He had taken his time, his energy, and his love, and he had communicated his self into our body. And there was no disease going to reach that self. One old book says, put your treasures where moths and thieves can't get at them. Well, in any case, this was the story that was coming up. My grandfather, he's telling me this. He was showing his sister Benny how to strike a match with one hand. He was 10, and they were sitting on his granddaddy's bale of hay. His granddaddy's bale of hay was right next to his granddaddy's barn. And after numerous failed attempts, he said to his sister Benny, we'll do this tomorrow. Let's go on in the house. And they did. But he was a little bit better at this trick than he realized. One of those match heads struck on his nail, went over his shoulder, but he and Benny were already in the house when that bale of hay erupted. And, of course, just like kindling wood to that barn, burned it down and everything in that barn. And everything in that barn was his granddaddy's cotton crop. His granddaddy was a cotton farmer. Burned it all down. Not only that year's crop, but next year's seed crop that had been set aside. That too was in the barn. Burned it all down. My granddaddy said to me, don't you know, boy, that was the worst day of my life. My granddaddy, he said, adopted me. And that's true. When my granddaddy his parents got a divorce when he was 6, and they gave him an option to live with his mother who was moving to Texas or stay there in Hartshorn, Oklahoma with his daddy. And he said, well, I want to stay with both of you. And they said, son, that decision has come and gone. We will no longer live together as man and wife. So it's your prerogative who you want to live with. And he said, if I can't live with you both, I want to live with my grandma and granddaddy. And they said, well, we'll ask them. And they walked across the yard. Mama, we explained to Dew that we were getting a divorce. And he said if he couldn't live with us both, he wanted to live with you and Daddy. Would that be all right? Without a pause, that boy could live here as long as he likes. So my granddaddy said to me, now don't you know my granddaddy took me in to raise like his own child, and I burned down his barn. I ruined him, boy. Don't you know that was the worst day of my life? My granddaddy was sitting on a stump waiting for his granddaddy to get home. When he did, his name was T.E. Rowe. The T stood for T, the E stood for E. He was walking across the yard where my granddaddy was sitting on a stump. In addition to being a cotton farmer, T.E. Rowe was the judge of Hartshorn, Oklahoma. I mention that so that you would know that for that little boy it was Judgment Day indeed. He said 3 times I tried to explain to my granddaddy what I had done, and 3 times I burst into sobs. There wasn't a lot really to explain. You could see in what was not left of that barn. The story was in embers and ashes. On the 3rd occasion when I burst into sobs, he said my granddaddy sat beside me on that stump. He put his arm around my shoulder, and he pulled me to his side, and he said, now boy, your old granddaddy has made a mistake or two in his life. The sun will come up tomorrow. And when my granddaddy told me this story, he looked at me in that couch from his orange recliner, and he said, now boy, that's love. He said, I'm 77 years old, and I hope before I die, I'll learn to love like my old granddaddy loved me. And when he said that, I saw the face that I wore before my mother and father were born. And I have a feeling that that was the face that my granddaddy saw on his granddaddy's face when he said, boy, your old granddaddy has made a mistake or two in his life. The sun will come up tomorrow. I wondered then and I wondered now, where did that old man, and by old man I mean my granddaddy's granddaddy, where did that old man in the moment of his financial ruin come by the wisdom and the grace to realize that in addition to raising cotton, he was raising a child, and that between the two there was no comparison of worth. And where there had been a barn, that old man built a bridge. He built a bridge from his heart to that little boy's heart who was on the other side of a chasm. And I'm glad that he did do that. I'm glad that he built a bridge and welcomed him to come back home. I'm glad that he said to him in so many words, son, there's nothing you can do in this family that would disqualify you from being a member of this family. I'm glad that he did that, because had he not done that, had he not remembered a dismembered little boy, my granddaddy would have grown up chronologically and biologically, but he would have always been a half a man, because a half a man would have always been on the other side of that ditch of that great transgression. And it would have been a half a man that raised my mother, and I would have been raised by a mother who was raised by a half a man. So I'm grateful for my granddaddy's granddaddy. I'm sharing this story with you because within just a 1,000 feet of this church, there must be any number of people who feel like that there is something about them now, something that they can't do that they used to be able to do, some kind of thing that they've been said that they have, some kind of label that they've been identified as, and consequently, they're not sure that they're full members of this community, that there's a half of them that they think is no longer worth being loved at all, and that is a terrible disease. And in the kingdom of God, as far as I understand it, nobody is ever disqualified from being a full member of the kingdom. And everybody, by virtue of being a human being, has got the capacity to go to one or more such people and to offer your face as a magic mirror, in which this person sees that in your face that they belong and that they matter and that their life is good. And they know that it's true because they can see it in you. And when you open your mouth, what they hear is that their life is good and that they matter and that they're not just a person with a disease. They know that you came and you didn't bring a tool. You brought your love. And you didn't need a toolbox because it was all over you and all in you. I want to thank this church for inviting me to be here today. I want to thank Bill Jinks for thinking it might be an opportunity for us to meet each other and to share Memory Bridge's mission. And I just want you to know that there's more medicine in your heart than that science and technology combined will ever be able to come up with. And it's a good time to begin sharing that medicine with the people you love. God bless you, and have a Magic Friday. Now, you could get some of your money back because I talked 15 minutes too long, but if you want it before you leave, you may need to go. But if you have any questions, I'm going to bring you this microphone and you can ask your question and we'll see if we can learn something. Don't be shy. You're in good company. When you get in the car, you're going to say, now, I wanted to ask him. Don't wait till you're in the car. Yes, sir. Let me give you this microphone so people can hear the question, then you give it back to me.
I want to know, when somebody has Alzheimer's, say, and they either don't respond to me or it's nonsense in their response, what do I say next?
Okay, this is tell me your name.
Brian.
Okay. Brian's question is, let's say I have a friend, a family member who has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and I initiate conversation and they don't respond back, or if what they say is nonsense, what do I say next? This is a good question, Bill. It's this kind of concern that we have that explains why so many people with dementia are isolated, because we are mammals and we are very self-conscious when we're in a social interaction that is not normal. And when we say something to somebody in terms that we're familiar with and they don't respond in terms that we're familiar with, well, that's not normal. And we feel very awkward when something's not normal. We remember what happened to the kids in first grade that couldn't pass for normal. They were bullied, they were ostracized. So we made a note to self, always pass for normal. We learned that. And then we spent the rest of our lives entering in different social situations, and we used a lot of our intelligence, because we're mammals, figuring out in this place what is normal, what's not normal, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. And we got real good at modulating our behavior so that we could pass for, is everybody with me? This is deep in us, because we are mammals, and if we ever get judged as not normal, there's a significant price to pay. So we spend a lot, but you got to know it takes a lot of cognitive capacity to keep up with these different ways in which we pass for normal or not normal. So is it Brian? What Brian is partly implicit in his conversation is that there are interactions that I may have or have had with people with cognitive impairment that didn't feel normal. And I'm not sure what to do when something's not normal. I totally understand that. Here's something I want to, for me, how I would make sense of Brian's question. What we call communication is immensely wider and deeper in its scope than talking. Okay, talking is a very small sliver of communication. And talking normally is even a smaller sliver of communication. So what I would want to remind myself when I'm in a situation like Brian is that I am having a conversation even if we're not talking. And if I say something and this person doesn't respond in a normal way, then I can continue to have the conversation through other means. So for instance, I am communicating by the way that I'm looking at this person, whether or not I think the fact that they can't keep up with me disqualifies them from talking to me. Is everybody with me? In other words, if this person doesn't say anything, one thing I can know is you haven't failed just because you haven't said something. See, if I think that you failed and I look at you like you failed, see, we're having a conversation. Do you see what I mean? Just because we're not talking, Brian, we are having a conversation. And one of the things that's being communicated between us is, am I acceptable to you? And what you can do, Brian, is no matter what you do, is not communicate that this person is not acceptable to you if they can't talk normally. And I'm sure you know how to communicate love to people that don't talk normally, because I'm sure that we've been in many instances where we communicate that we love somebody that isn't talking normally. Anybody that's ever held a child, anybody that's ever had a lover in certain intimate moments, we know that the most important communication we have is not talking. So I appreciate that this awkward that you didn't say something that I know what to say back. I appreciate that. So now I get to choose, what am I going to do in awkward? Brian, you get to choose what you're going to do here. If there was a thing that I could tell you called the formula, when someone doesn't talk or they say nonsense, then this is what you do. Well, there's no such formula. Because people with dementia, you mentioned Alzheimer's, of the irreversible forms of dementia, Alzheimer's is significantly different in its neurological substrate and its presentation than frontal temporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia. So if we say, what do I do when one of those people with dementia does this? Keep in mind, dementia doesn't tell us what this person has, so there is no one thing. Is everybody with me? It's as if my neighbor said, hey, we got a new pet. And I said, well, what kind of pet did you get? And they said, well, we got a mammal. And well, I will say, fantastic, I'm going to bring over a snack. Do I bring over a snack for a wombat, a blue whale? Do you understand? Dementia doesn't tell us anything. So there is no formula to what to do when those people don't talk, or when what they say is what we call nonsense. There is no formula for that. So what I'm suggesting that we can do is understand that this person's sense of self is dependent upon how I look at them when they can't pass for normal. And if I look at this person as if this conversation isn't over just because they can't pass for normal, then they're going to feel that they have accepted me even though I can't speak what used to be sense. And we'll start communicating on a different kind of sense. You will see in my face. Now, there are different things you could do, but I would have to know more of the particulars. So, for instance, Brian, if this person said something that didn't make sense, I could say, I didn't understand you. Are you talking about your mother or your father? That's one thing I could do, and this person may not be able to answer that. So one thing I could do is called an ambiguous pronoun. I can say, so was she that good to you? I said she because I don't know who you said, so I'm going to say she. Is everybody following with me? Or I can say, what's the worst thing? What's the worst thing about that? What's the worst thing when you feel like there's something you got to say and you can't say it? What's the worst thing? And what this person can feel is, this person has not judged me. You see, I'm communicating with him. In other words, there's not a magic answer. But if I know in my heart that your heart and my heart right now are still communicating, then I can love you in all kinds of ways, including saying, you know, I wish I knew what to say right now, but I don't. But I want you to know that it's an honor for me to be here. That's something you can say, you see. You don't have to know the answer. You could say, I wish I knew what to say, except I want you to know that it is a blessing to be able to be with you in this way. And that's a lot of sense. So I want to say there's no formulas. You see, there's not a formula of what to do when they don't talk, because there ain't a they. It would have everything to do with all sorts of things. Who is this person? What's my relationship with that person? But what I can do is make it possible for this person to not fail. You see, we're going to find a new normal. If you can't speak sense anymore, then we're going to speak emotional sense. We're going to find a new sense together. And what that person's going to feel when you leave the room is, I didn't fail. That's what they're going to feel when you left. They're going to feel like that person looked at me like they were glad they were here, and you will have communicated a lot of sense to them. And you can learn this as you go. And the real answer is, Brian, you would have to learn from this person because they're still communicating. They have a different language now. So you would have to learn the language that makes sense for them in that way. But there's no general answer because there's no general them. But the big point is, we're always communicating. Yeah, listen, I had a girlfriend once that said, now you're talking yourself into a lather. And that meant it was way over time. So everybody, thank you for your question, Brian. Thank you. And God bless you. God bless you.
Thank you all. I want to say you have seen